Good evening. Perhaps you're lying here tonight, feeling the weight of being alone. Perhaps solitude has settled around you like a blanket you didn't ask for. Perhaps you wonder if being alone means being lonely, if this quietness is something to fear or something to embrace. Tonight, through ancient Buddhist wisdom, we discover that solitude is not the same as loneliness. That being alone can be the doorway to finding yourself. Feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. Through 19 stories from mountain hermits and forest monks, from simple peasants to enlightened masters, we explore how solitude can become the richest companionship you've ever known. How being alone with yourself is perhaps the most honest relationship you'll ever have. Let your breath become soft and easy. Notice the gentle rise and fall of your chest. Let each exhale carry away whatever weight you've been holding. You may be here tonight because being alone feels difficult, because the silence amplifies your thoughts, because you're seeking some way to be at peace with your own company. These teachings speak directly to that longing. For over 2,000 years, monks and mystics have retreated into solitude, not to escape life, but to discover it more fully. These stories come from Japanese hermits who lived in mountain huts, Thai forest monks who wandered alone through wilderness, Chinese poets who made cold caves their homes. Their wisdom has guided countless seekers through the same questions you're asking now. Let yourself settle. Let the stories carry you gently. You are held. You are safe. Rest as we begin our journey together. In the mountains of 18th century Japan, there lived a monk named Ryokan who chose a life that puzzled everyone who knew him. He had been trained in one of the great monasteries, had studied under renowned masters, had proven himself capable of leading a temple and commanding respect. Yet at 33, he walked away from it all. He found a tiny hut halfway up Mount Kugami, a place so small it earned the name Gogoan, the 5-scoop hut, because that's how much rice it would take to fill the floor. The hut had a thatched roof that leaked when it rained. The walls were thin enough that winter winds passed through them as if through a sieve. Ryokan owned almost nothing. One robe, patched so many times the original fabric was hard to find. One begging bowl, cracked along the rim. A small kettle for making tea. A few books of ancient poetry that he'd copied by hand onto scraps of bark and paper he found discarded. Most days, Ryokan would wake before dawn and sit on the wooden porch of his hut, watching the mist rise from the valleys below. The silence at that hour was complete. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. The soft rustling of pine needles in the breeze, the distant call of a crow, the particular quality of stillness that comes when you're the only human for miles around. He would spend hours like this, not meditating in any formal sense, not reciting sutras or performing rituals, just sitting, just being. People from the village below who occasionally glimpsed him thought he must be lonely up there, cut off from conversation and community. They couldn't have been more wrong. Ryokan wrote in his journal during this time, his characters flowing onto birch bark in graceful strokes. He wrote about the way afternoon light fell through the pines, creating moving patterns on the forest floor. He wrote about listening to rain on the roof all night, each drop distinct, and how that sound became a kind of companionship more reliable than any human presence. He wrote about sitting by his tiny pond and watching water striders move across the surface, and how in those moments of pure observation, he forgot entirely that he was supposed to be alone. Once a scholar from the city made the long climb up the mountain to visit this strange hermit monk everyone spoke about. The scholar arrived in the late afternoon. Expensive robes dusty from the trail, carrying questions about Buddhist philosophy and enlightenment. He found Ryokan sitting under a pine tree, knees drawn up, gazing at nothing in particular. The scholar waited and waited. 3 hours passed. The sun moved lower. Still Ryokan sat, seemingly unaware of his visitor. Finally, as dusk began to settle, Ryokan stood, stretched, and noticed the scholar with evident surprise and delight. They talked through the evening about poetry and philosophy and the nature of the mind. The scholar was captivated. Ryokan's words carried a depth that came from somewhere beyond books. As night fell, Ryokan said he would go to the village to get sake so they could continue their conversation. The scholar settled in to wait. An hour passed. Then, too, growing concerned, the scholar finally walked toward the village path and found Ryokan sitting under another pine tree, completely still, his face turned toward the rising moon. The scholar approached, worried something had happened. Ryokan looked up with eyes full of wonder and said simply, "Isn't the moon splendid tonight?" He had forgotten entirely about the sake, about the scholar, about everything except this moment of beauty unfolding before him. This wasn't absent-mindedness. This was the fruit of solitude. Ryokan had become so comfortable with his own company, so at home in the present moment, that he could dissolve completely into whatever he was experiencing. The moon wasn't something separate from him that he was looking at. He had become the moon gazing, the moon itself, the night that held them both. This is what solitude had taught him. Not how to be alone, but how to be whole. Years passed like this. Ryokan never returned to formal monastic life. He never sought students or established a temple. He begged for food in the village a few times a week, often playing with children instead of collecting enough rice. He was so poor that when a thief broke into his hut one night, finding nothing worth stealing, Ryokan gave him his blanket and sat watching the stars, wishing he could have given the thief the moon. People called him eccentric. They didn't understand that he had found something most people spend their whole lives searching for. He had found himself, not the self that needs constant validation from others, not the self that's defined by roles and relationships, but the deeper self that exists independent of all that. The self that can sit alone under a pine tree and feel completely, utterly at peace. Breathe slowly now. Feel yourself arriving more fully in this moment. Notice how Ryokan's story touches something in you. This story reminds us that solitude is not about being cut off from life. It's about being connected to life so directly that you don't need the buffer of constant human interaction to feel real. Ryokan, in his mountain hut, was more alive, more present, more deeply engaged with existence than most people surrounded by crowds. Consider our modern lives. We fill every moment with noise. When we're alone in the car, we turn on the radio. When we're alone at home, we turn on the television. When there's a quiet moment, we reach for our phones, scrolling through other people's lives to avoid sitting with our own. We've become afraid of silence, afraid of our own company. We've confused being alone with being lonely, but they are not the same. Loneliness is the ache of disconnection. It's wanting to be with others and not being able to. It's feeling isolated even in a crowd because no one sees you. Solitude is different. Solitude is choosing to be with yourself. It's discovering that your own presence is enough, that you are interesting company, that the silence holds treasures you can only find when you stop filling it with distraction. Ryokan understood this deeply. He didn't run to the mountain to escape people. He went to the mountain to find himself. And what he found was that when you're truly comfortable being alone, you're never actually alone. The whole universe becomes your companion. The pines, the moon, the rain, the stones, everything speaks. Everything has presence. You realize you're part of something vast and interconnected, and that realization is the opposite of loneliness. Think about the moments in your own life when you felt most yourself. Chances are, many of those moments happened in solitude. Walking alone in nature, sitting with a book in the early morning before anyone else is awake. Those moments when you catch yourself simply being, not performing for anyone, not maintaining any image, just existing, just breathing, just here. What if solitude is not something to fear but something to befriend? What if the discomfort you feel when alone is not a sign that something's wrong, but a sign that you're finally being honest with yourself? All the things we avoid by staying busy, by staying surrounded, by never being truly alone, they're still there. They're waiting. Solitude doesn't create our difficulties. It reveals them, and in revealing them, it gives us the chance to finally address them. Ryokan spent decades in that tiny hut. He could have been lonely. By conventional measures, he should have been miserable. Instead, his poems overflow with joy. He writes about the happiness of finding wild mushrooms, the delight of watching children play, the deep contentment of sitting by his pond as evening falls. He found what solitude offers. Not the absence of connection, but a different kind of connection. Deeper, quieter, true. Let yourself absorb this wisdom. Let yourself consider that your own solitude, whether chosen or not, might be offering you something precious. The chance to know yourself, the chance to rest in your own presence without apology. Let your breathing slow. Feel your body sinking into rest. The next story finds you now. In 9th century China, in the Tiantai Mountains, there lived a poet whose given name has been lost to history. He called himself Han Shan, which means cold mountain, after the remote peak where he made his home. Some say he was a failed government official who fled political turmoil. Others say he was a scholar who simply walked away from privilege and comfort. What we know for certain is that around age 30, he disappeared into the wilderness and lived there for decades, writing poems on rocks and trees, creating one of the most beloved collections of solitary wisdom in all of Buddhist literature. Cold Mountain was not a gentle place. The winters were brutal, with snow piling higher than a man could reach. The cave where Han Shan lived offered minimal shelter. Wind howled through it. Ice formed on the walls. Food was scarce. He would trek down to a monastery several miles away to beg for scraps, looking so wild and ragged that some monks thought he was crazy. His clothes were patched rags. His hair grew long and tangled. His face was weathered like old wood. But if you read his poems, you discover something unexpected. This wasn't a man broken by hardship. This wasn't someone barely surviving. This was a man who had found a kind of freedom most people never imagined possible. He wrote about laughing at clouds, dancing alone in the snow, the pure joy of watching moonlight on frost. He had nothing, owned nothing, needed nothing, and somehow that made him rich beyond measure. One poem he scratched onto a boulder near his cave went like this: Cold Mountain has a dwelling with no partitions inside. 6 doors open left and right. From the hall you see blue sky wherever you look. The house is bare. The east wall greets the west wall. Nothing, really, between them. No need for anybody's care. This wasn't just describing his physical dwelling. This was describing his inner life. No partitions. No divisions between this and that. Between self and other. Between alone and together. His mind had become as open and spacious as the sky. And that spaciousness came directly from solitude. From years of having no one to talk to but himself, no one to perform for, no one whose approval he needed to seek. There's a famous story about Han Shan that reveals his relationship with solitude. A high official, having heard rumors of this enlightened hermit, sent servants to find him and bring him to the city, thinking such wisdom should be shared with scholars and leaders. The servants climbed the mountain and found Han Shan's cave. They saw him sitting near the entrance, warming his hands over a small fire. When Han Shan saw them approaching, he understood immediately why they'd come. He stood, walked to a crack in the cliff wall, and squeezed himself into it, crying out, "Thieves! Thieves!" Then the crack closed around him, and he vanished. The servants stood there, bewildered. When they returned to the official and told him what happened, the man finally understood. You cannot bring solitude to the marketplace. You cannot package silence and carry it to the city. Some things can only exist in their proper place. Han Shan's poems reveal what he found in that cold, harsh solitude. He found that most of what we think we need, we don't actually need. We need food, water, basic shelter. Everything else is extra. And all that extra, all those things we accumulate and pursue and worry about, they're weights we're carrying. They're barriers between us and direct experience of life. In one poem, he writes about former friends from his scholar days, men who now hold important positions, wear fine robes, live in comfortable houses. He says they're welcome to it all. He wouldn't trade places with them for anything, because they're trapped by their possessions, their positions, their reputations. They can never truly be alone, never truly be free. They always have to maintain their image, fulfill expectations, play their roles. But Han Shan, owning nothing, needed nothing from anyone. He could sit in his cave and be utterly, completely himself. This is one of the great gifts of solitude. It strips away the false self, all the masks we wear for other people, all the roles we play, all the ways we edit ourselves to be acceptable, to be liked, to be successful. None of that works when you're alone. You can't pretend to yourself. Not for long. Not in real solitude. Eventually you have to face who you actually are, beneath all the performance. And that can be terrifying at first, because who are we without our roles, without our relationships defining us, without our achievements validating us? It feels like nothing, like we might disappear entirely. But Han Shan discovered that on the other side of that fear lies something extraordinary. You don't disappear. You appear. The real you, the one that's been hidden under all those layers, finally emerges. Years passed. Han Shan grew old in his mountain solitude. His poems became simpler, more direct, more joyful. He wrote less about Buddhist philosophy and more about ordinary moments. The taste of wild berries, the sound of a stream after spring melt, the way morning light looks on new snow. These weren't escapes from spiritual practice. These were spiritual practice. Being fully present, fully alive, fully here. And because he was so deeply comfortable being alone, when people did occasionally visit, he could be genuinely with them, not performing, not trying to impress, not seeking anything, just sharing space, sharing words, sharing presence. Then when they left, he could return to solitude without any sense of loss, because he understood that connection and solitude aren't opposites. They're two expressions of the same thing. Being real. Your breath continues, steady and calm. Feel yourself settling deeper into rest. This teaching shows us that solitude can be a great teacher if we let it. Han Shan didn't start out enlightened. He started out running from political danger, probably scared and uncertain. But he stayed with his solitude instead of fleeing from it. He let it work on him. Let it strip away everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. In our lives, solitude often comes uninvited. A relationship ends. Friends move away. We change jobs and suddenly don't have the daily social interaction we're used to. Our children grow up and leave. We retire and lose the community of co-workers. These transitions can feel devastating. We label them as losses, as problems to solve, as situations to fix as quickly as possible by finding new connections, new activities, new ways to fill the time. But what if we're missing something? What if these moments of forced solitude are offering us exactly what Han Shan found in Cold Mountain? The chance to discover who we are when nobody's watching. The chance to sit with ourselves and find that we're actually pretty good company. The chance to stop running and just be. This doesn't mean we should all become hermits. Most of us aren't called to live in caves on remote mountains, but we can learn from those who did. We can take the essence of what they discovered and apply it to our modern lives. We can choose solitude regularly, even if just for an hour, and use that time to check in with ourselves without distraction. When you sit alone with no phone, no book, no television, just yourself and the silence. What comes up? At first, probably restlessness, anxiety, the urge to do something, anything. That's normal. That's your mind realizing it can't hide anymore. Stay with it. Breathe through it. Let the restlessness settle like mud in water. Eventually, beneath that agitation, you'll find something quieter, something steady. That's you. The real you, the you that doesn't need constant stimulation or validation. The you that simply is. Han Shan's poems point to this again and again. When you stop trying to be someone, you discover you already are someone. When you stop seeking, you find you already have what you were looking for. When you stop running from aloneness, you realize you were never really alone at all. Rest now. Let these words settle. Another story comes. In the forests of northeast Thailand, in the early 20th century, a young monk named Munburi Datta made a decision that would change not just his life, but the course of Thai Buddhism. He had been ordained in a city monastery, had studied the texts, had learned the rituals and ceremonies, but something felt hollow. The monasteries had become comfortable. Monks lived well, ate well, had servants. They studied philosophy but rarely meditated. They taught about renunciation while enjoying material comfort. Mun looked at this and thought, this is not what the Buddha taught. So he left. He gathered his few possessions, his robes and bowl, and walked into the vast wilderness that covered northeast Thailand at that time. Dense jungle, tiger country, places where humans rarely went. He walked alone, seeking the kind of solitude that would force him to face himself completely, with no safety net, no comfort, no way to hide. For years, he wandered. He would find a place that felt right, a clearing by a stream or a cave in a hillside, and he would stay there for weeks or months, meditating, observing his mind, watching how fear arose when he heard tigers in the night, watching how attachment arose even to his simple possessions, watching how the mind creates suffering out of nothing. The solitude was profound. Days would pass without seeing another human. Weeks sometimes. The only sounds were forest sounds, insects, birds, the rustle of animals moving through undergrowth. The only company was his own mind, and he discovered that his mind was not always friendly company. Doubts arose, fears, memories of his former life, longings for comfort and safety. All the things we usually distract ourselves from, Mun had to face directly because there was nothing else to do, nowhere else to go. One night, during a particularly difficult period of practice, Mun sat under a large tree deep in the forest. He had been battling intense fear for hours. Every sound seemed threatening. His imagination populated the darkness with dangers. He kept thinking he should leave, to find a village, return to the safety of a monastery. But something in him said no. Stay. Face this. So he sat through the entire night, trembling sometimes, sweating sometimes, but staying with the fear, watching it, letting it be there without running. As dawn broke, something shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but his relationship to it changed. He saw clearly that the fear was just a feeling, just sensations in the body and thoughts in the mind. It couldn't actually harm him. Only his resistance to it, his struggle with it, created suffering. When he stopped fighting, when he simply let the fear be there like clouds passing through the sky, it lost its power over him. This became one of the key insights that Mun would later teach his students. Solitude forces you to face everything you usually avoid. That's why it's difficult. But that's also why it's transformative. You can't run from yourself in true solitude. Eventually, you have to stop and turn around and look at what you've been running from. And when you do, you often find it's not as terrible as you thought. Mun continued his wandering practice for many years. Gradually, other monks heard about him and sought him out, asking to study with him. He would teach them not through lectures, but through example. He would take them into the forest and show them how to sit with silence, how to be alone without being lonely, how to find in solitude a kind of strength and peace that no amount of community or comfort could provide. One of his students, years later, wrote about the first time Mun took him deep into the wilderness. They walked for 2 days, carrying only their robes and bowls. They reached a place so remote that even the sounds of distant villages were gone. Mun told the student to find a spot and sit for the night. The student, terrified, asked what he should do about tigers or other dangers. Mun smiled and said, "The tigers are also afraid. Sit with your fear. Watch it. Learn from it." The student sat that night, shaking with terror. Every sound made him jump. His mind raced with thoughts of death and danger. But he sat, and slowly, as the night wore on, he began to notice something. His fear came in waves. It would peak, then subside. Peak, then subside. It wasn't constant. And in the spaces between the waves, there was something else. a kind of alertness, a clarity, a sense of being utterly present, more awake than he'd ever been in the comfortable monastery. By morning, the student hadn't slept, but he felt transformed. He had survived his fear. More than that, he had learned that he could be alone with the most difficult emotions and not be destroyed by them. Mun found him at dawn and asked how the night went. The student tried to explain the terror and the breakthrough. Mun nodded and said simply, "Good. This is how we learn who we really are." Mun spent decades in solitary forest practice before finally, in old age, settling in one place and formally teaching the growing number of students who sought him out. He became the founder of what's now called the Thai forest tradition, a lineage that continues to this day, emphasizing meditation, strict discipline, and periods of solitary retreat in nature. His influence transformed Thai Buddhism, bringing it back to its roots in direct practice rather than mere study. But all of that influence, all that teaching, came from his willingness to be alone, to walk into the forest with nothing and nobody, to sit with his fears and doubts and longings without any distraction, to find in solitude not loneliness, but liberation. Let your jaw soften. Let tension release from your neck. The next teaching arrives gently. Mun's story reveals something we often forget. Solitude is not comfortable at first. It's challenging. It brings up everything we've been avoiding. All the difficult emotions we've been keeping at bay with busyness and noise and constant stimulation. They all surface when we're alone. This is why so many people avoid solitude. It feels too hard, too painful. They think something's wrong when it feels that way. But Mun would say nothing is wrong. Everything is working exactly as it should. Solitude is supposed to be challenging. It's supposed to strip away your defenses. That's not a bug. That's a feature. That's how it works. That's how you grow. Think about times in your life when you've been forced into solitude and found it difficult. Maybe during a pandemic lockdown. Maybe after a breakup. Maybe in a new city where you didn't know anyone. The discomfort you felt wasn't a sign you were doing something wrong. It was a sign you were finally doing something right. Finally stopping long enough to feel what you actually feel. Finally being honest enough with yourself to see what you actually see. We spend so much energy managing our image for others, being the version of ourselves that we think people want to see. It's exhausting. But in solitude, all that drops away. You can't maintain a facade for yourself. You can't pretend to yourself. Not indefinitely. Eventually, the truth emerges. And yes, that truth might include seeing your fears, your insecurities, your wounds. But it also includes seeing your strength, your resilience, your capacity to be okay, even when things are hard. Mun, sitting alone in the forest, watching his fear peak and subside, learned something invaluable. He learned that he could handle difficulty, that he was stronger than he thought, that emotions, even intense ones, are temporary. They arise, they pass. If you can just sit with them without reacting, without running, they move through you like weather moves through sky. This is wisdom you can only gain in solitude. No one can teach it to you. You have to discover it yourself. And here's the beautiful thing. Once you know you can be alone with difficulty, alone with fear, alone with your own darkest thoughts, you become free in a way you've never been free before. Because you're no longer dependent on external conditions for your peace. You're no longer desperately seeking people or activities or substances to keep you from feeling what you feel. You can feel it. All of it. And you're okay. This doesn't mean you become cold or isolated. The opposite. Actually, when you're truly comfortable being alone, you can be with others more authentically, because you're not using them to escape yourself anymore. You're not demanding they fill your emptiness or fix your loneliness. You come to relationships as a whole person, not as someone desperately seeking completion. And that changes everything. Mun spent his life teaching this, not through words primarily, but through example, showing his students that strength doesn't come from avoiding difficulty. It comes from facing it. Peace doesn't come from surrounding yourself with comfort. It comes from learning to be at peace even without comfort. Freedom doesn't come from having everything you want. It comes from no longer needing things to be different than they are. These are lessons of solitude, gifts that only aloneness can give. And they're available to you right now, in whatever solitude you're experiencing, whether chosen or not. The question is, will you receive them? Will you stop running and turn to face what's there? Will you sit with the discomfort long enough to discover what's on the other side of it? Your breath knows what to do. Let yourself unwind, breath by breath. Rest as we move to the next story. There was a farmer in ancient China who worked a small plot of land at the edge of his village. His name was Vai, and he was known for keeping to himself, not from unfriendliness, but from a natural inclination toward quiet. While other farmers would gather in the evening to share news and gossip, Wei would finish his work and return to his small house, where he lived alone. The villagers thought this strange. Why doesn't Wei marry? They would ask. Why doesn't he join us in the evening? Doesn't he get lonely out there by himself? But Wei seemed perfectly content. His small garden was the most carefully tended in the village. His vegetables grew larger and healthier than anyone else's. His house, though simple, was always clean and in good repair. He seemed to have a quiet joy about him that others lacked. One spring, a Buddhist monk passed through the village and stopped at Wei's house, asking for a cup of water. Wei invited him to sit, served him tea instead of just water, and the two sat in comfortable silence for a while. The monk, whose name was Ziyuan, finally spoke. "I've been to many houses today," he said, "but only here have I found real peace." "What's your secret?" Wei smiled and said, "I have no secret. I simply tend my garden and enjoy my own company." "But don't you long for more?" Ziyuan asked. "A wife? Children? Friends?" Wei was quiet for a moment, considering. "I enjoy people well enough when they're here," he said, "but I don't need them to be here. When I'm working in the garden, I'm not alone. The earth is there, the plants, the insects, the birds. When I'm cooking my dinner, I'm not alone. The vegetables I grew are there, the fire, the smell of good food. When I'm sitting in the evening, I'm not alone. I have my thoughts, my memories, the sounds of night settling in. How could I be lonely when there's so much company?" Jiwan stayed with Wei for several days, watching how the farmer moved through his life with quiet mindfulness. Wei worked steadily but never hurried. He spoke little but listened deeply. He owned almost nothing but wanted for nothing. Ziyuan, who had spent years in monasteries studying Buddhist texts and practicing meditation, realized he was in the presence of someone who had found what all those studies pointed toward, not through religious practice, but through simple, honest living. On the last evening, Jiwan asked Wei if he had ever studied Buddhism. Wei laughed, a genuine sound of delight. "I've never even visited a monastery," he said, "but I've studied myself quite thoroughly. I've spent years watching my own mind, sitting with my own feelings, learning what I actually need versus what I just think I need. That seems like the most important study there is." "What have you learned?" Zhiyuan asked. Wei thought for a long moment. "I've learned that most suffering comes from wanting things to be different than they are. I'm alone. I could spend my life wishing I wasn't, wishing I had a family, wishing I had more friends, wishing I was different. Or I could accept that this is my life and find the goodness in it. And there's so much goodness. The smell of earth in spring, the taste of vegetables I grew myself, the satisfaction of fixing something that was broken, the peace of sitting with nothing needing to be done. I chose to find the goodness. And once I started looking for it, it was everywhere." After Zhiyuan left, he told this story to his students back at the monastery. Many of them were struggling with their practice, finding meditation difficult, feeling that peace was always just out of reach. "This farmer," Zhiyuan said, "is more accomplished than many monks who've practiced for decades. He understands the heart of the teaching. He's made friends with his own life, exactly as it is. That's enlightenment." Years later, when Wei was old, some young monks from Zhiyuan's monastery visited him. They expected to find a master who would give them profound teachings. Instead, they found an elderly man working in his garden, his movements slow but sure, his face peaceful. They asked him to teach them about Buddhism. Wei looked up from his planting, smiled, and said, "Buddhism? I don't know anything about Buddhism. But I can show you how to plant radishes so they grow sweet. I can show you how to sit quietly and enjoy a cup of tea. I can show you how to be okay with your own company." Isn't that enough? The young monks stayed with him for a week, helping in the garden, sharing simple meals, sitting in comfortable silence. They returned to their monastery changed, understanding something they couldn't quite put into words, but could feel deeply. They had touched a kind of peace that didn't depend on special knowledge or techniques. Just simple presence, simple acceptance, simple appreciation for what is. Notice your breathing, gentle and easy. Your whole body is beginning to rest more deeply now. Wei's story teaches us something essential about solitude. It's not about being physically alone. It's about being at peace with whatever your circumstances are. Wei could have been miserable living alone, spending his evenings wishing for different company. Instead, he found company everywhere. In his work, in nature, in his own thoughts and feelings. He made his life rich not by filling it with people and things, but by fully inhabiting the life he had. How often do we do the opposite? We have solitude forced upon us, or we choose it, and then we spend the whole time wishing we were somewhere else, with someone else, doing something else. We're alone, but we're not really present with our aloneness. We're fighting it, resisting it, waiting for it to end. And in that resistance, we miss everything it has to offer. Think about the last time you were alone and found it difficult. Were you actually present with yourself? Or were you trying to escape yourself through distraction? Were you listening to your thoughts and feelings? Or were you drowning them out with noise? Wei shows us another way. He shows us that solitude can be rich and full and satisfying when we stop wishing it away and start exploring what it actually contains. This is available to anyone, in any situation. You don't need to live alone or be a farmer or live in ancient China. You just need to be willing to be present with yourself when you find yourself alone. To notice what's actually here instead of lamenting what's not here. To find the small beauties and simple pleasures that exist in every moment if we're paying attention. Wei found satisfaction in growing vegetables and making tea. What are the small things that bring you satisfaction? Not the big achievements or exciting experiences, but the quiet moments, the feel of warm water when washing dishes, the sound of rain on the roof, the taste of your first sip of morning coffee. These small pleasures are always available. They don't require anyone else. They don't require special circumstances. They're right here, right now, waiting to be noticed and appreciated. Solitude gives us the space to notice these things. When we're always with others, always busy, always stimulated, these small moments get lost. But in solitude, they come forward. They become available. And if we receive them, if we let ourselves fully enjoy the simple act of being alive in this moment, we discover what Wei discovered. We're never actually alone. Life itself is always here, always offering us its presence. Wei didn't need people to validate his existence or prove his worth. He validated himself by showing up fully for his own life, by tending his garden with care, by preparing his meals mindfully, by sitting with his own thoughts without judgment. This is a practice anyone can do. And the more you do it, the more you realize that solitude isn't something to endure. It's something to treasure. A gift. A chance to be completely, authentically yourself. Let everything soften. Let yourself be held by the darkness. The next tale finds you. In the mountains of Tibet, there once lived a teacher named Jamyang who was known for taking students on unusual retreats. He would lead them to remote caves and huts scattered across the high peaks, assign each student their own space, and leave them alone for weeks or even months with minimal instruction. The students would think they were there to meditate, to achieve some spiritual breakthrough. But Jamyang knew they were there for something simpler and harder. They were there to meet themselves. One year, a student named Dorje joined Jamyang for such a retreat. Dorje was earnest and dedicated, having studied Buddhist philosophy for years. He arrived at the retreat site expecting profound teachings. Instead, Jamyang showed him to a small stone hut, gave him basic supplies, and said, "Sit with yourself. When you can't sit anymore, walk. When you can't walk anymore, sit. I'll check on you in 6 weeks." The first week was excruciating. Dorje tried to meditate, but his mind raced with thoughts. He tried to study his texts, but couldn't focus. He tried to sleep, but anxiety kept him awake. He felt like he was going crazy. The silence was oppressive. The solitude was crushing. He kept thinking he should leave, go back to the monastery where there was structure and community and things that made sense. But something kept him there. Maybe stubbornness, maybe curiosity, maybe just the embarrassment of quitting. So he stayed, and slowly, something began to shift. The thoughts that had seemed so urgent and important started to lose their power. He realized most of them were just repetitive loops, the same worries and plans and judgments cycling endlessly. When he stopped fighting them, stopped trying to control them, they began to quiet on their own. In the third week, Dorje had an experience he would remember for the rest of his life. He was sitting in his hut at dawn, not meditating formally, just being there, when suddenly he became aware of the silence, not as an absence of sound, but as a presence, a living quality. He could feel it, almost touch it. And in that silence, he felt held, supported, as if the whole universe was right there with him, in that tiny stone hut, and he was completely, utterly safe. Tears came then, not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. All his life, he had been running, keeping busy, staying distracted, always doing something, always with someone. He'd never realized he was running until he stopped. And now that he'd stopped, he discovered there was nothing to run from. The loneliness he'd feared was just a surface feeling. Beneath it was something else. A profound okayness. A sense that he was exactly where he needed to be. Exactly who he needed to be. And nothing needed to change. When Jamyang visited in the 6th week, he found Dorje sitting outside his hut, watching clouds move across the sky, a slight smile on his face. They didn't talk much. Jamyang could see the change. Dorje had found what every student was looking for, not in some mystical experience or philosophical breakthrough, but in the simple act of stopping, of being alone, of discovering he could be with himself, and it was okay. More than okay. It was good. Dorje stayed another month, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He had fallen in love with solitude, not in the sense of wanting to be alone forever, but in the sense of understanding its value. He saw that this time alone was like tilling soil. It broke up all the hard, compacted places in his mind. It loosened what had been stuck. It created space for new things to grow. And when he finally did return to the monastery, to the community of fellow students, he brought that spaciousness with him. The other students noticed the difference. Dorje was still friendly, still engaged, but he wasn't clinging anymore. He didn't need their approval or company to feel okay. He could be with them fully when he was with them, and he could be alone peacefully when he was alone. He had found an inner stability that didn't depend on circumstances. That's what solitude had given him. Years later, Dorje became a teacher himself. And like Jamyang, he would send students into solitary retreats. He would tell them, "You think you're going out there to meditate, but really, you're going out there to meet the person you've been avoiding your whole life. Yourself. It won't be comfortable at first. You'll want to run. But if you stay, if you sit with the discomfort, you'll discover something beautiful. You'll discover you're good company. You'll discover you're enough, just as you are. And that discovery will change everything. Let your mind become quieter. Let yourself drift deeper into rest." Dorje's journey shows us something crucial. The discomfort of solitude is not a problem to solve. It's a doorway to walk through. On one side is the self that needs constant validation, constant distraction, constant proof that we exist and matter. On the other side is the self that simply is, that knows its own worth without needing external confirmation, that can rest in its own presence without anxiety. Most of us spend our entire lives on the first side of that doorway. We never walk through because it looks dark and scary. We think if we're alone with ourselves for too long, we'll discover something terrible, that we're not enough, that we're unlovable, that there's some fundamental flaw that makes us unworthy of our own company. So we stay busy, stay connected, stay distracted, anything to avoid that confrontation with ourselves. But what if those fears are lies? What if the terrible discovery we're avoiding is actually a beautiful discovery? What if we're not fundamentally flawed, just fundamentally afraid? And what if facing that fear in solitude is the key to freedom? This is what happened for Dorje. The first weeks were hard because he was confronting all his conditioning, all the messages he'd received about needing to be productive, needing to be with others, needing to constantly achieve and prove and perform. None of that worked in solitude. There was no one to perform for, nothing to achieve, no way to prove anything. Just him, sitting in a stone hut, being. And at first his mind screamed that this was wrong, that he should be doing something, that this was a waste, that he was failing. But when he stopped believing those thoughts, when he just let them be there like birds flying through the sky, something else emerged. A deep quiet, a profound peace, a sense that just being alive, just breathing, just existing was enough. More than enough. It was everything. This is the gift of solitude. It strips away everything we use to hide from ourselves. Our roles, our relationships, our accomplishments, our possessions. All the things we point to and say, "This is who I am." In solitude, those things fall away. And what's left is the raw fact of your existence. Just you. Just here. Just now. And if you can stay with that, not try to dress it up or distract from it or escape it, you discover it's beautiful. It's enough. You're enough. This doesn't mean you never want connection again. It doesn't mean you become a hermit. It means you no longer desperately need connection to feel okay. You no longer use other people to avoid yourself. When you're with others, you're truly with them, not using them as a distraction. And when you're alone, you're truly with yourself, not wishing you were somewhere else. Dorje found this balance, and it transformed not just his practice, but his whole life. He became more present, more genuine, more at peace. Not because he achieved some special state or gained some special knowledge, but because he learned to be comfortable in his own skin, to be okay with his own mind, to find in himself a kind of home that he could return to no matter what was happening around him. This home is available to you too. It's not somewhere else. It's not something you need to achieve. It's right here, right now, waiting for you to stop running and notice it. And solitude is the path that leads you there. Not as punishment, not as something to endure, but as an invitation. An invitation to finally, truly meet yourself. Your body knows how to rest. Let yourself be carried by this knowing. Another story arrives. In a monastery in ancient Japan, there was a young monk named Kenzo who struggled with loneliness. Unlike most monks who seem to thrive in the quiet routines of monastic life, Kenzo felt isolated. He would sit in meditation hall, surrounded by dozens of other monks, and feel utterly alone. He couldn't understand it. He was in a community. He had teachers and fellow students. Why did he feel so disconnected? One day, the abbot called Kenzo to his quarters and said, "I'm sending you to the mountain hermitage for 3 months. You'll stay there alone." Kenzo's heart sank. He was already lonely in the monastery. How would 3 months of actual solitude help? But he bowed and accepted the assignment. The hermitage was a small building at the edge of monastery property, surrounded by forest. It had a room for sleeping, a room for meditation, and a tiny kitchen. That was all. Kenzo arrived with his few belongings, feeling like he'd been sent into exile. This was punishment. Surely, though he didn't know for what. The first weeks were as miserable as he'd feared. The loneliness that had been a background ache in the monastery became a screaming pain. He thought about leaving, about giving up his monastic vows, about running back to his family, to the ordinary world where at least there were people and noise and distraction. But one morning, something shifted. He was sitting on the porch of the hermitage, watching the sunrise, feeling that familiar, crushing loneliness, when a question arose in his mind. Who is lonely? It wasn't a philosophical question. It was genuine curiosity. There he was, alone, feeling lonely. But who exactly was feeling it? Where was this lonely person? He turned his attention inward, looking for the one who was lonely. And the strangest thing happened. He couldn't find anyone. There were thoughts about being lonely. There were feelings of loneliness in his body. But when he looked for the actual lonely person, the self who was supposedly suffering, he couldn't locate it anywhere. It was like chasing a shadow. The harder he looked, the more it disappeared. This shook something loose in Kenzo. He realized that his loneliness wasn't about being alone. It was about a story he was telling himself about being alone. The story said, "I'm separate. I'm isolated. I'm cut off from others." But when he looked directly at his experience, that story didn't hold up. Yes, there was no other human present. But that didn't mean he was separate or isolated. He was sitting on a porch. Trees surrounded him. Birds called. Wind moved through branches. He was part of this, not separate from it, connected to it. The loneliness didn't disappear overnight, but its hold on him began to loosen. Each time it arose, Kenzo would ask, "Who is lonely?" And each time, he'd find that the lonely self was just a thought, not a solid reality. The more he saw this, the less he believed the story of separation. By the end of 3 months, Kenzo had changed profoundly. When the abbot visited to bring him back to the monastery, Kenzo asked if he could stay longer. The abbot smiled. "You can return now," he said. "You've learned what you needed to learn." Back at the monastery, Kenzo found that the loneliness that had plagued him was gone. Not because his circumstances had changed. The monastery was the same. He was still surrounded by people, but not in constant interaction with them. What had changed was his understanding. He no longer believed the story that being alone meant being lonely. He saw that loneliness was a thought pattern, not a truth. And thoughts could be questioned. More than that, he'd discovered something beautiful. He'd learned that the sense of separation he'd always felt was an illusion. Even when he was physically alone, he wasn't separate from life. He was part of the forest, the wind, the sunrise, part of everything. This wasn't just a philosophical idea. It was a felt reality. He could sense his connection to everything around him, and that sense of connection meant he was never truly alone. Kenzo spent the rest of his life at the monastery, eventually becoming a teacher himself. Students would come to him with their struggles, and often those struggles involved loneliness or fear of being alone. Kenzo would tell them about his 3 months in the hermitage. He would ask them, "Who is lonely? Can you find this lonely person?" And he would invite them to look, really look, at their experience, instead of believing their stories about their experience. Many students found the same thing Kenzo had found, that loneliness was a story about separation, and separation was an illusion. Yes, we're in individual bodies. Yes, we have unique experiences, but that doesn't make us separate from everything else. We're part of the same reality, the same life force, the same existence. When we see this clearly, loneliness loses its sting. We can be alone without feeling lonely because we understand we're never actually alone. Feel yourself melting into rest. Everything is as it should be. Kenzo's realization points to something profound about loneliness. It's not actually about being alone. It's about feeling separate. And that feeling of separation comes from believing a story about who we are. The story says, I'm in here, behind these eyes, separate from everything out there. That story creates a sense of isolation, of being cut off, of being fundamentally alone in a way that's frightening. But when we look closely at our actual experience, as Kenzo did, we find that story doesn't hold up. Where is the boundary between in here and out there? Your body is breathing air that was just in the trees. Your body is made of food that came from the earth. The sounds you hear are vibrations moving through air into your ears, becoming electrical signals in your brain. Where's the separation? It's not in your experience. It's only in your thoughts about your experience. This is radical, and it might sound strange or abstract, but it's actually very practical. If loneliness comes from feeling separate, and feeling separate comes from believing a story, then questioning that story can free us from loneliness. Not by changing our circumstances, not by surrounding ourselves with people, but by seeing through the illusion of separation. Try this now, in your own experience. You're lying here alone, listening to these words. Notice if there's any loneliness or sense of isolation. If there is, ask yourself Kenzo's question, who is lonely? Look for the lonely one. Not as a concept, but in your actual, direct experience. Can you find a solid, separate self that's lonely? Or do you just find thoughts about loneliness? Feelings that come and go, sensations in the body? When you look closely, you might discover what Kenzo discovered, that the lonely self is a story, not a reality. And if it's a story, you don't have to believe it. You can see it for what it is. Just thoughts, just conditioning, just old patterns playing out. And in seeing it clearly, its power over you dissolves. This doesn't mean you'll never feel lonely again. Feelings arise. That's natural. But you won't be owned by those feelings anymore. You won't believe they're telling you something true about your fundamental nature. You'll see them as weather passing through, and you'll know the sky they're passing through is vast and clear and never actually touched by the weather. Kenzo taught this to his students, not as philosophy, but as practice. When loneliness arises, he would say, don't run from it and don't believe it. Investigate it. Look directly at it. Ask who is lonely. Keep looking until the story dissolves, and what's left is just this moment, just this aliveness, just this being here. This is advanced practice, but it's also simple. It's just questioning your assumptions, just looking at what's actually true instead of what you think is true. And what you'll find, if you look honestly, is what countless practitioners before you have found. That separation is an illusion. That connection is the reality. That, even in solitude, even in silence, even when no other human is present, you are held by life itself. You are part of everything. You are everything. And in that recognition, loneliness becomes impossible. Not because you're with others, but because you see that you were never actually apart from others. Never apart from life. Never apart from this vast, mysterious, beautiful existence that we're all part of. Let this understanding settle into your bones. Let yourself rest in this knowing. Your breath continues. steady and sure. In the forests of Vietnam, centuries ago, there lived a monk named Tien Tri, who had chosen a path of extreme solitude. He built a small hut deep in the jungle, so remote that even other forest monks rarely ventured there. He lived on wild vegetables and whatever food villagers occasionally brought when they made the difficult journey to seek his blessings. Days would pass, sometimes weeks, without seeing another human face. One rainy season, a young man named Lin made the journey to Tien Tri's hut. Lin had recently lost his wife to illness and felt utterly alone in the world. He had heard stories of this hermit monk who had mastered solitude and hoped to learn how to bear his own loneliness. He found Tien Tri sitting outside his hut despite the rain, face turned upward, completely still. Lin approached and bowed, but Tien Tri didn't acknowledge him. Hours passed. The rain continued. Lin waited, soaked and shivering. Finally, as evening approached, Tien Tri turned and smiled at him. "You're still here," he said. "Good. Most people leave when they're uncomfortable. I need to learn how to be alone," Ling said. "My wife died 6 months ago. The house we shared feels like a tomb. I can't bear the silence. I can't bear my own company. Everyone tells me I'll adjust, that time will heal, but it only gets worse. How do you do it? How do you live out here with no one and seem so peaceful?" Tien Tri was quiet for a long time, water dripping from the edge of the hut's roof in steady rhythm. "You think I'm alone out here?" he finally asked. "Aren't you?" Lin replied, confused. "Come," Tien Tri said, standing. He led Lin to a small clearing behind the hut where a vegetable garden grew. "See these plants? I talk to them every day, not because they understand my words, but because it reminds me they're alive, growing, reaching toward light just like I am. See that tree?" He pointed to an enormous banyan whose roots spread like a vast network across the ground. "That tree has been my teacher for 20 years. It stands through storms, bends in wind, loses leaves in dry season and grows them back in wet season. It teaches me about impermanence, about resilience, about just being without needing anything to be different." They walked further, to a small stream. "This water," Tien Tri said, "flows day and night. It never stops, never complains, never wishes it were somewhere else. It simply flows. When I sit by it, I'm not alone. I'm with the water, learning its way of being." He turned to Lin. "You say you're alone in your house, but that's not quite true. You're alone with your grief. You're alone with your memories. You're alone with your thoughts about your wife, about your loss, about your future. Those are very loud companions. No wonder you can't bear the silence." Lin felt tears coming. "How do I make them quiet?" "You don't," Tien Tri said gently. "You make friends with them instead. Right now you're fighting your grief, your memories, your thoughts. You want them to go away, but they're part of you. Fighting them is like fighting yourself. That's exhausting. That's unbearable. What if you stopped fighting?" They returned to the hut. Tien Tri made tea over a small fire and they sat together in the doorway, watching night settle over the forest. "When I first came here," Tien Tri said, "I was running from something too. Not grief like yours, but shame. I had failed as a monk in the monastery. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't meditate, kept breaking rules. I thought, If I came out here, away from everyone, I could finally practice properly. But the first year was torture. All the things I was trying to escape, they came with me. Out here, with nothing to distract me, they were louder than ever. What changed? Lin asked. I stopped trying to make them go away. One day I was sitting in meditation, completely frustrated because my mind wouldn't settle, and I just gave up. I thought, fine, if my mind wants to be chaotic, let it be chaotic. I'm not going to fight anymore. And in that moment of giving up, something shifted. The chaos didn't disappear, but my relationship to it changed. It was just weather, just thoughts and feelings moving through. I didn't have to fix them or fight them or make them different. I could just let them be. He poured more tea. Your grief is like that. It's weather moving through you. Some days it's a light rain. Some days it's a storm. But you are not the weather. You're the sky it moves through. The sky is never damaged by weather. It holds everything. Fierce storms and gentle rains and clear blue days, and remains unchanged. That's who you really are. The unchanging awareness that holds all your experiences. Lin stayed with Thien Tree for 3 days. The monk taught him to sit with his grief instead of running from it, to feel it fully, to let it move through his body like waves, to cry when tears came and be still when they passed. He taught him to talk to his wife's memory, not to push it away, to thank her for their time together, to tell her he missed her, to let the relationship continue in a new form. Most importantly, Thien Tree taught Lin that solitude was not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is wanting someone to be there who isn't. He explained, solitude is being fully present with what is. You can be lonely in a crowd if you're wishing for different company. You can be peaceful alone if you're accepting of the company you have, even if that company is just yourself and your memories and the silence. When Lin left, he still grieved. His wife was still gone, but something had fundamentally shifted in how he related to his loss. He no longer felt that being alone in his house was unbearable. It was just what was. Some days were hard. Some days were less hard. But he could sit with all of it without needing it to be different. And in that acceptance, he found a kind of peace he hadn't known was possible. Years later, Lin would tell others who were grieving about his time with Thien Tree. He would say, "The monk taught me that I was never actually alone. My grief was there with me. My love for my wife was there with me. My memories were there with me. Even the silence had a presence, a quality, a companionship, if I learned to listen to it. When I stopped fighting being alone, when I made friends with everything that was there, I found I had more company than I'd ever had before. Not the company I wanted, maybe, but real company nonetheless. Let your shoulders drop just a little. Feel tension releasing from your body. The next story finds you now." Thien Tree's teaching shows us something we often miss about solitude. We think of it as empty, as nothing, as absence. But real solitude is full. It's filled with whatever is actually here when we stop distracting ourselves. For Ling, it was filled with grief and memories and love that had nowhere to go. For Thien Tree, it had been filled with shame and failure and restlessness. For you, it might be filled with something else. But it's not empty. It's never empty. The question is, can you be with what's actually there? Or do you need to keep running, keep distracting, keep filling the space with noise and busyness and other people so you don't have to face what you're carrying. Lin had been running. His grief was so painful that he couldn't bear to be alone with it. So he tried to stay busy, stay around people, stay distracted. But the grief followed him everywhere because it wasn't outside him. It was inside him. Running from solitude was really running from himself. And you can't run from yourself forever. Eventually, you have to stop and turn around and face what's there. Tian Tree showed him how. Not by making the grief go away, but by changing his relationship to it. By seeing that he could feel grief without being destroyed by it. That he could remember his wife without it being unbearable. That the pain was part of love, and love was worth the pain. When he stopped fighting, when he stopped wishing things were different, the experience became manageable. Not easy, not comfortable, but bearable. And that made all the difference. This is what solitude offers us. The chance to stop running and face whatever we're carrying. It's not comfortable. It's not easy. But it's honest. And there's a deep relief in finally being honest with ourselves. In finally acknowledging what's actually there instead of pretending it's not. In finally feeling what we feel instead of pushing it down or covering it up or medicating it away. Think about what you're carrying right now. What fills your solitude when you can't distract yourself from it? Maybe it's grief like Lin's. Maybe it's regret about choices you've made. Maybe it's fear about the future. Maybe it's shame about your past. Maybe it's anger at someone who hurt you. Whatever it is, it's there. And being alone brings you face to face with it. You can keep running, keep staying busy, keep surrounding yourself with people and noise and distraction. That's one choice. Or you can do what Lin learned to do. You can stop running. You can turn and face what you're carrying. You can sit with it, breathe with it. Let it be there without trying to fix it or fight it or make it different. And in that radical acceptance, you might find what Lin found. That you're strong enough to hold it. That it's part of you, but it's not all of you. That you are, as Tian Tree said, the sky that holds all weather. This doesn't mean the pain disappears. Lin's grief didn't disappear, but it became integrated. It became part of his life instead of something he was fighting against. And that integration, that acceptance, that making friends with what is, that's what allows us to be at peace even in difficult circumstances, even in solitude, even with whatever we're carrying. Tian Tree lived in that forest for 40 years. He died there, alone, sitting in meditation. But those who knew him said he was never lonely. He had learned what all the great hermits learn. That solitude is not empty. It's full of life, full of presence, full of the raw reality of just being here. And if you can make friends with that reality, if you can accept it without needing it to be different, you find a richness that no amount of company or distraction could ever match. Your mind is becoming quieter. Let yourself drift deeper. Another teaching comes. There was a woman in ancient China named Mei who worked as a weaver in a small mountain village. She had never married, had no children, lived in a tiny house at the edge of town. The other villagers pitied her. Poor Mei, they would say, all alone in the world, no family, no one to care for her. What a sad life. But if they had actually asked Mei, they would have discovered she didn't feel sad at all. Mei loved her life. She woke each morning before dawn and sat in her doorway watching the light change over the mountains. She would drink tea slowly, not rushing, just being there with the warmth of the cup in her hands and the steam rising into cool air. Then she would go to her loom and weave for hours, her fingers moving in practiced rhythm, her mind quiet and focused. She made beautiful cloth that people came from distant villages to buy. In the evenings, she would walk in the forest behind her house. She had favorite trees she would greet, touching their bark, feeling their solid presence. She had favorite spots where she would sit and listen to birds settling for the night. She would gather wild mushrooms and herbs, noticing which plants were thriving, which needed more rain, feeling herself part of the cycle of growth and decay and growth again. One autumn, a merchant passed through the village and stayed at the inn. He heard the other villagers talking about May, about how alone she was, how sad it must be. The merchant was curious. He had traveled widely and met many people, and he wondered if this woman was really as pitiful as the villagers suggested. So he went to her house one evening and asked if she would sell him some cloth. May invited him in. Her house was small but immaculate. Simple furnishings, everything in its place. A sense of order and peace pervaded the space. The merchant noticed fresh flowers in a clay vase, carefully arranged. He noticed the quality of light through the window, how she had positioned her loom to catch it. He noticed her calm demeanor, the way she moved with quiet grace, unhurried but efficient. They talked as she showed him different fabrics. The merchant, who prided himself on reading people, tried to find the sadness the villagers spoke of. He looked for signs of loneliness, of regret, of bitterness about her solitary life. He found none. Instead, he found someone deeply content, deeply present, deeply at peace. Finally, he asked directly, "The villagers say you're lonely, living here alone with no family. Is it true?" May smiled. "The villagers measure happiness by how many people surround you. By that measure, I suppose I should be miserable, but I measure happiness differently. I measure it by how much I appreciate each moment. By that measure, I'm the wealthiest person in this village. But don't you wish for a husband, children, the warmth of family?" The merchant pressed. May considered this. "I don't wish for what I don't have," she said. "I have this house. I have my work, which I love. I have the forest. I have the mountains. I have this moment, right now, talking with you. These are real. These are here. Why would I spend my energy wishing for different things and miss the goodness of what I actually have?" The merchant stayed talking with her for hours. She served him tea and simple food, and he found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did. There was no pressure to perform, no need to impress, no social dance to navigate. May was simply herself, completely unpretentious, completely genuine, and in her presence, he could be simply himself too. As he was leaving, the merchant said, "I travel constantly. I'm never alone. I'm always with people, always doing business, always in new cities, meeting new faces. And yet, I often feel lonely. You live alone in this small house and seem to never feel lonely at all. How is that possible?" May walked him to the door and pointed at the night sky, brilliant with stars. "See those stars?" she asked. "They're millions of miles apart, each one alone in the vastness of space. Are they lonely? Or are they each exactly where they need to be, doing exactly what they're meant to do? Their light reaching across the darkness to touch other light. I'm like that. I'm here, in my place, doing my work, and my light touches the light of others when our paths cross, like tonight. But I don't need constant company to feel connected. I'm already connected to everything. The stars, the mountains, the trees, the earth beneath my feet. How could I be lonely when I'm part of all this? The merchant left May's house that night changed. He continued his travels, continued his busy life surrounded by people. But he never forgot the weaver who lived alone and was happier than anyone he'd ever met. And sometimes, in the middle of a crowded marketplace or a loud business meeting, he would remember her words about the stars, and he would feel less lonely himself. May lived to be very old. When she died, the villagers said, "She died alone. Poor woman." But that wasn't quite right. She died in her house, in her bed, with the mountains visible through her window and the sound of wind in the pines coming through the open door. She died surrounded by everything she had loved. Not alone at all, just as she had lived. Notice your breath, moving in and out like gentle waves. Let yourself be cradled by the quietness. May teaches us about contentment. She had what so many of us lack, the ability to fully appreciate what she actually had instead of longing for what she didn't have. This is rare. Most of us spend our lives wishing for different circumstances, different relationships, different versions of ourselves. We think happiness lies somewhere else, with someone else, in some other time. And in that constant wishing, we miss the life we're actually living. May didn't do this. She didn't wish for a husband or children or a bigger house or more excitement. Not because she was resigned or settling, but because she had learned to find richness in simplicity, to find companionship in solitude, to find connection in being present with what is. This is a practice anyone can do, but it requires a shift in how we think about life. We've been taught that more is better. More friends, more activities, more experiences, more possessions. We've been taught that being alone is sad, that solitude is something to avoid, that if we're not constantly connected and engaged, we're missing out. May understood this was backward. She understood that quality matters more than quantity. That one moment of genuine appreciation is worth more than 1,000 moments of distracted busyness. That sitting alone in her doorway drinking tea mindfully was richer than any party or social gathering where she'd be performing, managing her image, trying to be liked. She understood that true wealth is measured not by what you have, but by how deeply you can be with what you have. Think about your own life. How often are you truly present with what's here? Or are you usually somewhere else in your mind, planning the future, rehashing the past, wishing for different circumstances? When you eat, are you tasting the food or scrolling through your phone? When you walk, are you feeling your body move or lost in thought? When you're with people, are you actually there or partly somewhere else? May's practice was presence. Complete, undivided attention to each moment. This is why her solitude was rich instead of empty, because she was fully there for it. She wasn't alone wishing she was with someone. She was alone, being completely with her aloneness, and in that completeness, there was no lack, no absence, no loneliness. This is available to you right now. Whatever your circumstances, whatever your level of solitude, you can practice what May practiced. You can be fully here instead of partly here. You can appreciate what is instead of longing for what isn't. You can find the goodness in this moment instead of waiting for some future moment to be better. It sounds simple, and it is simple, but it's not easy. Our minds have been trained to always want more, always seek elsewhere, always think the next thing will be the thing that finally makes us happy. Breaking that habit requires intention and practice. It requires choosing again and again to come back to now, come back to here, come back to this. But the reward is immense. When you can be fully present with your life, just as it is, you find what May found. That life is already rich, already full, already complete. Not because you have everything you want, but because you can appreciate everything you have. And that appreciation, that presence, that deep satisfaction with what is, that's true wealth. That's real happiness. And it's available whether you're alone or with others, whether you're rich or poor, whether your circumstances are ideal or difficult. May, sitting in her small house drinking tea, was wealthier than merchants with their gold, wealthier than families with their children and noise and bustle, because she had something money can't buy and circumstances can't give. She had peace. She had presence. She had the ability to be completely at home in her own life, and that made her solitude not a burden but a gift. Let everything soften. Your whole body sinks deeper into rest. Listen as the next story begins. In the mountains of Korea, there lived a monk named Sung-san who had an unusual way of teaching about solitude. He would take students to a remote temple and assign them to spend 7 days in complete silence, alone in separate rooms, with minimal food and no books or anything to occupy them. Just 7 days of sitting with themselves. One winter, a young man named Jin-ho came to study with Sung-san. Jin-ho was from a wealthy family in Seoul, used to comfort and constant activity. He had everything: career, friends, a beautiful apartment, but felt empty inside. He'd heard that Buddhism could help with this emptiness, so he'd come to the mountains seeking answers. Sung-san looked at him for a long time, then said, 7 days alone. That will show you what you need to see. Jin-ho agreed, thinking 7 days wasn't so long. He was wrong. The first day was okay. Jin-ho sat in his small room, tried to meditate, watched the snow fall outside his window. He felt peaceful, even virtuous. This Buddhist practice wasn't so hard. But by the second day, restlessness set in. He had no idea what to do with himself. He tried meditating but couldn't concentrate. He tried sleeping but wasn't tired. He tried just sitting, but his mind raced with thoughts. He started counting the hours until this would be over. By the third day, Jin-ho was in hell. The silence was oppressive. His own mind was unbearably loud. Every uncomfortable thought he'd ever had seemed to surface. Memories of failures, of times he'd hurt people, of opportunities he'd missed, fears about his future, doubts about his choices, judgments about himself and others. It was like every demon he'd been keeping at bay with busyness and distraction had been set free. He wanted desperately to leave, to run back to Seoul, back to his comfortable life, back to the noise and activity that kept him from feeling these things. But something kept him there. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, maybe some deeper wisdom that knew he needed this, even though it was excruciating. On the fourth day, something broke open. Jin-ho was sitting in meditation, or trying to, when suddenly he started crying. Not delicate tears, but huge sobs that shook his whole body. He cried for hours, for no reason he could name. All the sadness he'd never let himself feel, all the pain he'd been carrying, All the loneliness that he'd covered up with constant activity, it all poured out. When the crying finally stopped, he felt emptied, like a vessel that had been full of dirty water and was now clean. He sat in his room, and for the first time in days, maybe years, he felt quiet inside. Not the frantic quiet of trying to suppress thoughts, but a genuine stillness, a peace. The last 3 days were completely different. Jin-ho sat in his room and actually enjoyed it. He noticed small things. The pattern of frost on the window, the sound of his own breathing, the feel of cloth against his skin. He discovered he could spend an hour just watching the light change as the sun moved across the sky. And it wasn't boring. It was fascinating. Every moment was alive, was fresh, was here. When Sung-san came to collect him after 7 days, Jin-ho bowed deeply. "I understand now," he said. "What do you understand?" Sung-san asked. "I understand that I've been running from myself my whole life. All the activity, all the friends, all the noise. It was all just running. And I was running because I thought being alone with myself would be unbearable. But it's not unbearable. It's just honest. And honest is better than comfortable." Zongzane smiled. "So what will you do now?" Jin-ho thought about this. "I'll go back to Seoul, back to my life. But I'll take this with me. This knowing that I can be alone and be okay. That I don't need constant distraction. That being with myself isn't something to avoid. It's where truth lives." He did return to Seoul, but he was different. He built periods of solitude into his life. 1 day a week, he would turn off his phone, stay home, and just be with himself. No agenda, no entertainment, no distraction, just sitting with whatever arose. Sometimes it was peaceful, sometimes it was difficult, but it was always real, always honest. And that honesty became the foundation of his life. Years later, Jin-ho would tell others about his 7 days of solitude. He would say it was the hardest thing he'd ever done and the most valuable. In those 7 days, he would explain, "I met myself for the first time. Not the self I present to the world, not the self I think I should be, but the actual, real, messy, complicated, beautiful, difficult self that I am. And once I met that self, I didn't have to run from it anymore. I could accept it. And that acceptance changed everything. Feel your jaw releasing any tightness it's been holding. Let yourself begin to unwind, breath by breath." Jin-ho's 7 days show us something important about the relationship between solitude and self-knowledge. We can go our whole lives without really knowing ourselves. We know the version of ourselves we present at work, the version we show to friends, the version we show to family, the version we show on social media. But the actual self, the one beneath all those presentations, often remains hidden even from us. Solitude strips away those presentations. When there's no one to perform for, when there's nothing to distract you, you finally encounter the raw reality of who you are. And that encounter can be shocking. You discover you're carrying pain you didn't know about, anger you've been suppressing, sadness you've never let yourself feel, but you also discover strengths you didn't know you had. Resilience, depth, the capacity to be with difficulty without breaking. This is why solitude is so valuable and why so many people avoid it. It's valuable because it shows you the truth. It's avoided because that truth can be uncomfortable. We prefer our illusions. We prefer thinking we're fine, everything's okay, we're handling life well. Solitude can shatter those illusions. It can reveal that we're not fine, everything's not okay, we're barely holding it together. And that revelation is painful. But it's also liberating, because once you know the truth, you can work with it. You can address what needs addressing. You can heal what needs healing. You can accept what needs accepting. As long as you're running, as long as you're avoiding, nothing can change. But when you stop running, when you sit with yourself in honest solitude, change becomes possible. Jinho discovered this. The first 3 days were hell because he was confronting everything he'd been avoiding. All the pain, all the fear, all the difficult truths about himself and his life. It was overwhelming. But when he stopped fighting it, when he just let himself feel everything he'd been suppressing, something shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it became integrated. It became part of him instead of something he was fighting against. This integration is what solitude offers. When you're constantly distracted, constantly busy, constantly surrounded by people and noise, you fragment. Parts of you get pushed aside, disowned, ignored. The painful parts, the shameful parts, the parts that don't fit the image you're trying to project. But those parts don't disappear. They just go underground. And from underground, they influence your behavior in ways you don't understand. They create anxiety, depression, restlessness, that constant feeling that something's missing. Solitude brings all the parts back together. In the silence, in the aloneness, all the disowned parts surface. They can't be ignored anymore. And if you can sit with them, if you can acknowledge them and feel them and accept them, they integrate back into the whole. You become more complete, more honest, more real. This doesn't happen overnight. Jinho had 7 days, but for most of us, this integration is a lifelong process. But even small doses of honest solitude help. Even an hour of sitting with yourself. No phone, no book, no distraction. Just being can reveal something you've been avoiding, can bring a part of you back home. The practice is simple. Find time to be alone, really alone. Not just physically alone, but alone in attention. No distractions, no entertainment, no escape routes, just you and the silence. Then notice what comes up. Don't judge it. Don't fight it. Don't try to fix it. Just notice it. Let it be there. Breathe with it. This is how integration happens. Not through analysis or understanding, but through acceptance. Through allowing everything to be as it is. Jinho learned this in 7 difficult days. You can learn it in whatever solitude you have available. The amount of time doesn't matter as much as the quality of attention. If you're fully present for 1 hour of solitude, really there, really allowing whatever arises, that hour can change you, can show you who you actually are beneath all your defenses, can integrate what's been fragmented, can make you more whole. And wholeness, that's what we're all seeking. Not perfection, not the absence of pain or difficulty, but wholeness. All parts included. Nothing rejected. Nothing disowned. Solitude is the path to that wholeness. Not because being alone makes you whole, but because being alone reveals what's been missing. And in that revelation, in that honest encounter with yourself, healing becomes possible. Your breath continues, steady and calm. Everything can wait until tomorrow. Another story finds you. In a small village in Tibet, there lived an elderly woman named Dolma who had lost everyone. Her husband had died years ago. Her children had moved to distant cities. Her friends had passed away or left. At 75, she found herself completely alone in the house she'd lived in for 50 years. The other villagers expected her to move, to go live with her children, to find some way to not be alone. But Dolma stayed. She would wake each morning and make tea for one. She would sit at her table and drink it slowly, looking out at the mountains she'd seen every day of her life. She would tend her small garden, talking to the plants as she always had, even though now no other human voice answered her. She would cook simple meals and eat them in silence. She would go to bed early and rise early, her days structured around the rhythms of her own needs and no one else's. A visiting monk named Tashi came through the village one summer and heard about Dolma. He was curious about this old woman who chose to live alone when she could have lived with family. So he visited her, bringing tea as a gift. Dolma welcomed him warmly. They sat in her garden and talked. Tashi noticed something unusual. Despite being alone, despite her losses, Dolma seemed lighter than most people he met. There was no heaviness about her, no bitterness, no self-pity. She spoke about her husband and children with love but no clinging. She spoke about her solitary life with contentment. "Doesn't it make you sad?" Tashi finally asked. "Living here alone after so many years of family?" Dolma was quiet, considering, "When my husband first died," she said, "I thought I would die too. The loneliness was crushing. Every corner of this house reminded me of him. Every meal I cooked for two out of habit, then remembered he was gone. I wanted to die rather than live without him." "What changed?" Tashi asked. "Nothing changed," Dolma said. "He was still dead. I was still alone. The house still held all our memories. But my relationship to those facts changed. I stopped fighting them. I stopped wishing things were different. I stopped waiting for the pain to go away so life could start again. I realized this was life. This pain, this aloneness, this emptiness. This was what I had. And I could either spend however many years I had left fighting it, or I could accept it and find out what acceptance might offer." She poured more tea. "So I started practicing acceptance. Every morning, I would wake up and the first thought would be, 'He's gone.' And instead of pushing that thought away or drowning it out with activity, I would just let it be there. Yes, he's gone. That's true. And I would feel the sadness of it. And then I would get up and make my tea and start my day." "And that helped?" Tashi asked. "It helped more than anything else I tried," Dolma sighed. "Because when I stopped fighting the reality of my situation, I had energy for other things. I started noticing things I'd never noticed before. The way morning light falls across the kitchen table, the sound of wind in the apple tree, the feel of bread dough under my hands when I'm kneading. These small things became precious because I was paying attention to them instead of being lost in my fight against loneliness." Tashi stayed for several days, observing Dolma's life. He saw that she had created rituals for herself. Every morning, the same routine: tea, garden, preparation of meals. Every evening, the same: washing up, reading by lamplight, early bed. The repetition might have seemed boring to an outsider, but Tashi saw it was grounding for her. It gave structure to days that could otherwise feel empty and purposeless. He also noticed how present she was. When she was in the garden, she was completely in the garden, not thinking about the past or worrying about the future. Just there, hands in soil, sun on her face. When she was preparing food, she was fully engaged with it, chopping vegetables with careful attention, tasting and adjusting seasonings, taking pleasure in the simple act of cooking, even though she was cooking only for herself. On his last evening there, Tashi said, "You've taught me something important. I thought solitude was about removing yourself from the world. But you've shown me it's about being more present with the world, not less." Dolma smiled. When you have other people around, it's easy to be distracted, to live half-present, divided between your own experience and your awareness of others. Your need to respond to them, to take care of them, to maintain the relationship. Being alone strips all that away. There's just you and life. And if you can be with that, really be with it, you find it's enough. More than enough. After Tashi left, he told others about Dolma. Word spread of this elderly woman who had transformed her solitude into something beautiful. People would visit her, asking how she did it. And she would always say the same thing. "I stopped fighting what is. I stopped wishing for what was or what might be. I started being completely present with what is. That's all. That's everything." Dolma lived another 10 years, alone in that house, tending her garden, making her tea, living her simple, quiet life. When she died, peacefully in her sleep, the villagers found her journal. In it, she had written near the end, "I thought losing everyone would kill me." In a way, it did. It killed the version of me that needed others to feel whole. And in that death, a new me was born. One who is complete alone. One who can be with life exactly as it is and find it beautiful. I am grateful for this gift, even though I would never have chosen it. Let your body become heavy now. Let your mind become quiet. The next teaching arrives gently. Dolma's story speaks to something we often face as we age. Loss becomes more common. People die, move away, drift apart. The world we knew changes. The people who defined us disappear. We can respond to this by becoming bitter, isolated, desperate to cling to what remains. Or we can respond, as Dolma did, by accepting the reality of loss and discovering what acceptance offers. She discovered what many who practice acceptance discover. That fighting reality is exhausting and futile. Reality doesn't change because we don't like it. Her husband was dead. That was a fact. She could spend the rest of her life fighting that fact, wishing it weren't true, drowning in the unfairness of it. Or she could accept it and discover how to live with it. Acceptance doesn't mean liking something. It doesn't mean thinking it's okay or giving up on changing what can be changed. It means acknowledging what is true without adding extra suffering through resistance. Dolma's husband was dead. That hurt. But when she stopped fighting that hurt, stopped trying to escape it, or deny it, or distract from it, the hurt became manageable. It was just pain. Just grief. Just the natural response to loss. And she could be with that. This is crucial to understand about solitude, especially unwanted solitude. If you're alone because of loss, because of circumstances beyond your control, you can make it worse by fighting it, by telling yourself stories about how it shouldn't be this way, how it's unfair, how you can't bear it. Those stories add a layer of suffering on top of the natural pain of the situation. They turn pain into agony. But if you can practice what Dolma practiced, if you can acknowledge the reality without the stories, something shifts. The situation doesn't change. You're still alone. You still feel the loss. But the quality of your experience changes. Instead of drowning in resistance, you're present with what is. And that presence, that acceptance, creates space for other things, for noticing beauty, for finding small pleasures, for being alive to this moment instead of lost in wishes for different moments. Dolma found joy in simple things: tea, garden, bread dough. These aren't dramatic pleasures, but they're real. They're here. They're available even in solitude, even in loss. When we stop demanding that life give us what we want, we can appreciate what life is actually giving us. And what it's giving us is always this moment, this breath, this sensation, this experience of being alive. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop caring. Dolma still cared deeply. She cared for her garden, her home, herself. She maintained connections with the few people who visited. But she didn't need things to be different to be okay. She was okay with what was. And that okayness, that fundamental acceptance of her life as it actually was, gave her a peace that no amount of clinging or fighting could provide. Think about the parts of your life you're fighting. The parts you wish were different. Maybe it's your relationship status. Maybe it's your health. Maybe it's your age or your circumstances or your past. What would happen if you stopped fighting, not stopped caring, but stopped fighting? Stopped insisting that things should be different. Just accepted. Yes, this is how it is. This is what I'm working with. That acceptance might feel like giving up, but it's not. It's actually the opposite. It's showing up. It's being present with reality instead of lost in fantasies about how reality should be. And when you're present with reality, you can work with it. You can find the gifts in it. You can discover, as Dolma did, that even difficult circumstances contain beauty, contain meaning, contain opportunities for growth and understanding. Dolma's solitude was forced on her by loss, but she transformed it into something chosen. She chose to accept it, to work with it, to find what it had to offer. And what it offered was a depth of presence, a quality of attention, a capacity for contentment that she might never have found if her life had stayed easy and full of people. Not that she would have chosen this path, but once she was on it, she made it her own. This is available to you too. Whatever your solitude, whether chosen or forced, whether temporary or permanent, you can fight it or accept it. You can resist reality or work with reality. And that choice makes all the difference between suffering and peace. Everything is as it should be right now. Let yourself rest in this knowing. Another story comes. In ancient Japan, there was a samurai named Takeshi who had grown weary of constant warfare. He had served his lord faithfully for 20 years, had fought in countless battles, had seen too much death and destruction. At 40, he asked permission to retire from service and become a monk. His lord, recognizing Takeshi's sincerity, granted his request. Takeshi entered a monastery, expecting to find peace in the structured life of meditation and study. But after a year, he was still restless. The monastery was busy, full of monks coming and going, chores and ceremonies and schedules. It felt like another kind of warfare, just with different weapons. He spoke to the abbot about this, and the abbot said, "Perhaps you need deeper solitude. There's a hermitage 3 days' walk from here, in the deep mountains. No one has lived there for years. Perhaps that's what you're seeking." Takeshi made the journey and found the hermitage, a small wooden structure half hidden by overgrowth. He spent weeks clearing it, repairing the roof, making it habitable. Then he settled in to see what solitude might teach him. The first months were strange. After a lifetime of constant activity, constant orders, constant engagement with others, the silence felt alien. Takeshi would wake each day and have to figure out what to do with himself. There were no battles to fight, no orders to follow, no structure imposed from outside. Just him and the mountains and the endless days stretching ahead. He tried to impose his own structure. Wake at dawn, meditate, eat simple meals, study Buddhist texts, meditate again, sleep. But the structure felt hollow. He was going through motions without understanding why. One day he threw down the book he was reading and asked out loud, "What am I doing here?" No answer came. Just the sound of wind in the pines. Takeshi sat with that silence, and something occurred to him. He had spent his whole life doing what others told him to do. First his father, then his military commanders, then the monastery's abbot. He had never really chosen his own direction. He had never asked himself what he actually wanted, who he actually was beneath all the roles he'd played. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. He was free now, completely free. No one was telling him what to do. But freedom without direction felt like drowning. He had no idea who he was when he wasn't being a samurai or a student monk. He had no idea what he wanted when there was no authority figure to want things for him. He spent weeks sitting with this question. Who was he? What did he want? Not should want, but actually want. It was harder than any battle he'd fought. Because in battle, at least you know who the enemy is. Here, the only enemy was his own confusion, his own lifelong habit of looking outside himself for direction. Slowly, tentatively, answers began to emerge. He liked simple things. The sound of a stream, the feel of wood grain under his hands when he worked with it, the taste of wild vegetables, the sight of sunrise over the peaks. These weren't things he should like. They weren't impressive or important. They were just true. He actually liked them. He started structuring his days around these genuine preferences. He would wake when his body wanted to wake, not at some prescribed time. He would spend hours by the stream just listening to it, not because that was part of a practice, but because he enjoyed it. He started carving small wooden sculptures, not for any purpose, but because working with his hands felt satisfying. He let go of trying to be a good monk and just started being Takeshi. One spring, a young monk from the monastery came to visit, bringing supplies. The monk found Takeshi sitting by the stream, whittling a piece of wood. They talked, and the young monk said, "I thought you'd be deeper in practice by now, more enlightened. But you're just sitting here carving." Takeshi smiled. "I'm deeper in practice than I've ever been. I'm practicing being myself. That's harder than any meditation." "But isn't that selfish?" the young monk asked. "Shouldn't you be working toward enlightenment, toward helping others?" "I spent 20 years trying to be what others wanted me to be," Takeshi said. "First a good samurai, then a good monk. I lost myself completely. Out here, in this solitude, I finally have the space to find out who I actually am. Not who I should be, but who I am. Maybe that seems selfish, but I think you have to know yourself before you can genuinely help anyone else. Otherwise, you're just performing helpfulness, playing a role. The young monk left puzzled, but years later, after his own struggles with authenticity, he would understand what Takeshi meant. Takeshi lived in that hermitage for 30 years. He never became famous, never gathered students, never wrote important texts. He just lived quietly, honestly, being himself. And in that quiet honesty, he found what he'd been seeking all along. Not peace as absence of conflict, but peace as presence of truth. The truth of who he actually was, stripped of all pretense and performance. When he was old, another monk came to visit and asked him what he'd learned in all his years of solitude. Takeshi thought for a long time, then said, "I learned that you can't find yourself in a crowd. You can only find yourself alone. And once you've found yourself, you can return to the crowd without getting lost again." That's the gift of solitude. Not separation from others, but discovery of self. And that discovered self is what you bring back to the world. Feel yourself settling deeper. Let the stories work on you as you drift towards sleep. Takeshi's journey reveals something essential about solitude and identity. We construct our sense of self largely through our relationships and roles. We're someone's child, someone's employee, someone's friend. We're a certain profession, a certain nationality, a certain personality type. These identifications give us structure, give us a sense of who we are, but they're also limiting. They can prevent us from discovering who we are beneath all those roles. Solitude strips away the roles. When Takeshi left the monastery for the mountains, he left behind the identity of samurai and monk. All that was left was Takeshi. But who was Takeshi? He didn't know. He'd never had the space to find out. His whole life had been spent fulfilling roles, meeting expectations, being what others needed him to be. He had never asked what he needed, what he wanted, who he actually was beneath all the performance. This is true for most of us. We're so busy playing our roles, meeting our responsibilities, living up to expectations, that we never stop to ask who we actually are. What do we actually like? Not what we're supposed to like. What do we actually want? Not what we're supposed to want. What brings us genuine joy? Not performative joy. Solitude gives us the space to ask these questions. When there's no one to perform for, when there are no expectations to meet, you finally encounter yourself directly, and that encounter can be shocking. You might discover you don't like things you thought you liked. You might discover desires you've been suppressing. You might discover your whole life has been lived according to someone else's script. This discovery can be painful. Takeshi went through months of confusion and uncertainty. He had to deconstruct everything he thought he knew about himself and start over. That's not comfortable. It's easier to just keep playing the roles, keep meeting the expectations, keep being who you've always been, even if that person isn't really you. But the pain of that deconstruction is temporary. The freedom on the other side lasts. Once you know who you actually are, once you've found your genuine self beneath all the conditioning and performance, you can't unknow it. And that knowledge changes everything. You stop living for others' approval and start living for your own integrity. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What feels true to me?" This doesn't mean you become selfish or isolated. The opposite. Actually, Takeshi discovered that once he knew himself, once he was comfortable in his own skin, he could be with others more authentically. He wasn't using relationships to hide from himself anymore. He wasn't performing for approval. He was just being, and that genuine being was what others actually needed from him. But you can't give what you don't have. If you don't know yourself, you can't be yourself. And if you can't be yourself, your relationships are all performances. They might look good on the surface, but there's something missing. That authenticity, that realness, that sense of genuine connection. It can't exist when both people are performing roles instead of being real. Solitude is where you learn to be real, where you strip away the performance and encounter yourself directly. It's uncomfortable, it's challenging, but it's essential. Because unless you know who you are alone, you don't really know who you are at all. You just know your roles. And roles are not selves. They're costumes we wear. Solitude is where we take off the costumes. Takeshi spent 30 years doing this. You don't need 30 years. Even small doses of genuine solitude, of being alone without distraction, without performance, without any role to play, can reveal something true about who you are. And each revelation, each moment of recognizing something real about yourself, brings you closer to that freedom Takeshi found. The freedom to just be. Nothing more. Nothing less. Just yourself. Completely and unapologetically. Let go of any need to figure anything out. Let yourself just be here. Rest now as we continue. There was a fisherman in a coastal village in Vietnam who went out alone on his boat every day, while other fishermen worked in groups, telling stories and joking to pass the time. This man, whose name was Min, preferred to go out alone before dawn and return after dark. The other villagers thought him strange, even unfriendly. But Min wasn't unfriendly. He simply treasured his solitude. On the water, hours from shore, Min would feel something he never felt on land. A deep quietness. A sense of being held by something vast. The ocean stretched in all directions. The sky arched overhead, and he was a small vessel in the middle of it all. This perspective, this sense of scale, brought him peace. He would sit in his boat for hours sometimes, not fishing, just being, watching the light change, feeling the rocking of waves, listening to the sounds of water and wind and the occasional cry of seabirds. There was no one to talk to, no one to impress, no role to play. Just him and the ocean and the sky. One day, a young man from the village asked if he could come fishing with Min. The young man was going through a difficult time, had lost his way, and thought maybe being out on the water would help. Min agreed, though he warned, "I don't talk much when I'm out there." They went out before dawn, the boat cutting through dark water. The young man tried to make conversation, but Min's responses were brief. Eventually, the young man fell silent, slightly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to so much quiet. As the sun rose, Min stopped rowing and let the boat drift. He baited his lines and set them, then sat back and waited. The young man did the same. An hour passed. 2 hours. Nothing but the gentle rocking of the boat, the sound of water, the cry of birds overhead. The young man kept wanting to say something, anything, to fill the silence. But Min's peaceful presence somehow made that seem wrong. So he just sat. By midday, something had shifted in the young man. The restlessness he'd felt that morning had quieted. He realized he hadn't thought about his problems for hours. He'd just been here, on the water, in the boat, present. And that presence felt like a gift. When they returned to shore that evening, the young man thanked Min. "I understand now," he said, "why you go out alone. It's not about catching fish, is it?" Min smiled. "The fish are a benefit. But no, it's not about fish. It's about getting away from all the noise, all the words, all the thinking. Out there, everything is simple. Water, sky, boat. Nothing needs to be said. Nothing needs to be done except be here. That simplicity is medicine for the mind." The young man asked if he could come again. Ming agreed. Over the next months, the young man went out with Min regularly, learning to sit in comfortable silence, learning to be present without distraction, learning the gift that solitude offers. His life problems didn't disappear, but his relationship to them changed. He found a calm center that remained even when life got chaotic. Years passed. The young man eventually got his own boat and began going out alone, just as Ming did. Other fishermen thought it was strange, two men who could fish together choosing to fish alone. But those who knew them understood. They weren't being antisocial. They were tending to something essential. The need for silence, the need for simplicity, the need to step out of the constant noise and complication of human life and into something more fundamental. Min grew old. His body weakened. Eventually, he could no longer go out on the water alone. The young man, now not so young, would visit him and they would sit together, looking at the sea they both loved. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They had learned the language of silence together. When Min died, his funeral was small. He had no family, few close friends, but the young man spoke, and he said, "Min taught me the most important thing I've ever learned. He taught me that you don't need words to have a relationship. You don't need constant interaction to feel connected. Sometimes the deepest connection happens in silence. Sometimes being alone together is richer than being crowded with others." After the funeral, the young man went out on his boat alone, as he often did, and as he sat there in the silence, feeling the rock of the waves, watching the endless sky, he felt Min's presence. Not in any supernatural way, but in the silence itself. Min had taught him this silence, and now, whenever he entered it, he carried Min with him. This is what solitude offers, a connection that goes deeper than words. Your breath continues, steady and sure. Let yourself sink into complete rest. Min's story shows us a different dimension of solitude, not solitude as isolation, but solitude as connection to something beyond the human. On the water, hours from shore, Min connected with something vast. The ocean, the sky, the fundamental forces of nature. These connections nourished him in ways human connection couldn't. This is something we often forget in our culture that's so focused on human relationships. We think connection means connecting with people. And yes, that's important. But there are other forms of connection. Connection with nature. Connection with silence. Connection with the vast mystery of existence itself. These connections are available in solitude, and they can be as nourishing, as profound, as meaningful as any human relationship. When was the last time you felt connected to something larger than yourself? Not through thinking about it or reading about it, but through direct experience? When was the last time you sat with nature, with silence, with the simple fact of being alive, and felt held by something vast? For many of us, it's been a long time. We're so busy with human concerns, human relationships, human dramas, that we forget the larger context we exist in. We forget we're part of nature, part of the planet, part of an enormous cosmos. We get trapped in our small concerns and lose perspective. Solitude in nature can restore that perspective. When you sit alone by the ocean, as Ming did, or in a forest, or on a mountain, or even in a park if that's what's available, you remember your place in the larger whole. You're small. Your problems are small. And there's something freeing about that. Not in a nihilistic way, like nothing matters, but in a liberating way, like you can let go of taking yourself so seriously. Min didn't need to solve all his problems or figure out his life. He just needed to sit on the water and be part of the immensity. That immensity held him. It held his problems, his worries, his whole small life. And in being held like that, he found peace. This is available to you. Not necessarily on a boat in the ocean, but in whatever way you can access solitude in nature. Even sitting alone in your backyard looking at the sky can offer this. Even a solitary walk in a park. The key is to actually be present, not lost in thought, not on your phone, but actually there, looking, listening, feeling, letting the more than human world remind you that you're part of something vast. And here's something beautiful that Min understood. When you make these connections in solitude, when you learn to feel held by the vastness, you carry that with you. You carry the ocean, the sky, the silence, the simplicity. It becomes a resource you can draw on even when you're back in the noise and complication of normal life. It becomes an anchor, a center, a place of return. Min didn't need to be on the water every moment to benefit from it. The hours he spent in solitude on the ocean stayed with him. They shaped him. They gave him a peace that others could feel even when he was on land, in the village, among people. The solitude wasn't separate from his social life. It enriched his social life by giving him something solid to stand on, something true to draw from. This is why solitude and connection aren't opposites. They're complements. Time alone, especially time alone in nature, fills us up in ways that being constantly social cannot. And when we're filled up, we have more to offer when we do connect with others. We're not desperately seeking from them. We're not using them to fill our emptiness. We're coming to them whole, with something to give. Min taught the young man this, and the young man carried it forward. This is how wisdom works. Not through words primarily, but through presence, through showing what's possible, through living in a way that makes others curious about what you've found. You can do this too. You can find your own version of Min's boat, your own place of solitude where you connect with something larger, and you can let that connection fill you, sustain you, remind you of what's real, beneath all the noise and complication of daily life. Nothing needs your attention right now. Rest deeply. The final story comes. In a monastery in the mountains of China, there lived an old abbot named Huineng, who was known for his unusual teaching method. When students came asking to learn meditation or study Buddhist philosophy, he would often send them to a small hut at the edge of monastery grounds and tell them to sit there alone for a month. No books, no teachings, no instructions. Just sit. One autumn, a scholar arrived at the monastery. His name was Liu, and he had studied Buddhism for years, had read all the important texts, could quote sutras from memory. But he felt something was missing. He had all this knowledge in his head, but he didn't feel transformed by it. He came to Huineng, hoping to find what was missing. Huineng listened to Liu talk about his studies, his questions, his seeking. Then he said simply, "Go to the hut. 1 month. Sit." Liu was insulted. "I didn't come here to sit in a hut. I came to study with you. I have questions that need answers." Huineng smiled. "The hut will answer your questions better than I can. Go." Reluctantly, Liu went to the hut. It was bare. One room, a sleeping mat, a cushion for sitting. That was all. Liu sat down, and immediately his mind filled with questions, objections, plans. What was he supposed to do here? What was the point? He should leave, find a real teacher, not waste time sitting in an empty room. But something kept him there. Maybe pride. Maybe a deeper wisdom that knew this was necessary, even though his mind rebelled against it. So he stayed. Days passed. Liu tried to meditate, but couldn't settle. He tried to think through his philosophical questions, but they seemed pointless without anyone to discuss them with. He tried to plan what he would do when the month was over, but planning felt hollow. Everything he tried to do with his mind felt empty, meaningless. By the second week, Liu was in crisis. All his life, he had identified as a scholar, as someone who knew things, who understood Buddhism intellectually. But sitting in this hut, all that knowledge seemed useless. He couldn't think his way to peace. He couldn't analyze his way to wisdom. His mind, which he had always relied on, was failing him. One morning, exhausted from sleepless nights, Liu stopped trying. He gave up on meditating, on thinking, on doing anything at all. He just sat there, empty, defeated. And in that emptiness, something happened. He noticed the morning light coming through the window. Just light. Nothing special. But he really noticed it, not thinking about it, analyzing it, comparing it to other light he'd seen, just seeing it directly. For the first time in his life, Liu experienced something without his mind interpreting it. The light was just light, and it was beautiful in a way no words could capture. He sat there for an hour, maybe more, just looking at the light, and the looking was enough. More than enough. It was everything. That was the beginning of Liu's transformation. Over the remaining 2 weeks, he learned to just be with whatever was present. The sound of wind, the feel of the mat beneath him, the sensation of breathing. Nothing special, nothing mystical, just direct experience without the constant commentary of his thinking mind. When the month ended, Huineng came to the hut. He found Liu sitting by the window, peaceful and present. They looked at each other and Huineng laughed. "So," he said, "did the hut answer your questions?" Liu laughed too. "It showed me I was asking the wrong questions. I wanted to understand Buddhism. But Buddhism isn't something to understand. It's something to live. It's this. Just this. Being here without all the thinking and analyzing and seeking. I spent years studying it in books when all I needed to do was stop and actually be present with life." "So what will you do now?" Huineng asked. "I'll go home," Liu said. "Back to my ordinary life. But I'll take this with me, this knowing that I don't need to understand everything. I don't need to figure everything out. I can just be here, present, awake to whatever is happening. That's enough. Liu did return home. He kept his books, kept his interest in Buddhist philosophy. But it was different now. The knowledge served his practice instead of replacing it. He would study, then set the books aside and just sit, just be present, just experience life directly. And in that balance between learning and being, between knowledge and presence, he found what he'd been seeking. Years later, others would come to him asking about Buddhism, and he would tell them about his month in the hut. He would say, "You can read 1,000 books about water, study its chemical composition, understand its properties, write treatises about it. Or you can actually drink water and know it directly. Most seekers study water. Few actually drink. The hut taught me to drink instead of just study. And that made all the difference. Let everything dissolve. Let yourself float into sleep." These teachings continue their work even as you rest. Liu's story brings us to the heart of what solitude offers. In our busy lives, surrounded by information and stimulation and constant input, we rarely experience anything directly. We're always thinking about our experience, analyzing it, comparing it, trying to understand it. Our minds are so active, so noisy, that direct experience becomes almost impossible. This is why meditation is so difficult for most people. Not because it's complicated, but because we can't stop thinking long enough to just be. We sit down to meditate, and immediately the mind starts commentating. Am I doing this right? Is this working? This is boring. I should be feeling something. Why isn't this working? Maybe I'm not cut out for this. On and on. We can't access direct experience because thinking is in the way. Solitude, especially extended solitude with nothing to do, can quiet that thinking. Not by force, not by trying to stop thoughts, but by exhausting them. Liu spent 2 weeks trying to think his way through his situation. Eventually, his thinking just wore itself out. It ran out of material. And in that exhaustion, direct experience became available. He could see light without thinking about light. He could be without thinking about being. This is precious. This is what all the Buddhist texts are pointing toward. Not more thinking, not more analysis, not more understanding. Just this, direct, unmediated presence with what is. And you can't get there through more knowledge. You can only get there by stopping, by being quiet, by letting your mind exhaust its habitual patterns so something simpler can emerge. Solitude creates the conditions for this. When you're alone with nothing to do, nowhere to go, no one to talk to, the mind eventually runs out of material. It can't maintain its constant commentary forever. And when it finally quiets, even for a moment, you taste what Liu tasted. The simplicity of just being, the richness of direct experience, the peace of presence. This doesn't mean you never think again. Liu kept his scholarly interests, but thinking became a tool instead of a prison. He could think when thinking was useful, then set it aside and just be. That flexibility, that ability to shift between thinking and being, that's wisdom. Most of us are stuck in thinking. We can't turn it off. It runs constantly, commenting on everything, trying to figure everything out, maintaining a constant barrier between us and direct experience. Solitude can break that pattern. Not immediately, not easily, but persistently. If you sit with yourself long enough, with nothing to do and nowhere to hide, your thinking will eventually quiet. And in that quiet, you'll discover what was there all along beneath the noise. Just this. Just presence. Just being alive. And that's enough. More than enough. Liu discovered this. You can discover it too. Not by reading more books or gaining more knowledge or understanding more concepts, but by stopping, by being quiet, by letting yourself be alone with nothing to do until all the doing drops away and only being remains. That's the ultimate gift of solitude. Not knowledge, not understanding, not answers to your questions. Just the direct taste of being alive. Just presence. Just this. And once you've tasted it, once you know it's available, everything changes. You stop seeking outside yourself. You stop thinking happiness is somewhere else, with someone else, in some other moment. You recognize it's right here. Always has been. Always will be. Just this. Just now. Just being. That's all. That's everything. Tonight we have journeyed together through stories of hermit monks and solitary fishermen, of weavers and farmers, of scholars and seekers. We have learned that solitude is not the same as loneliness. That being alone can be the richest companionship. That finding yourself in silence is perhaps the most important discovery you'll ever make. As you drift into sleep now, let these teachings settle into your heart. You do not need to remember every story. You do not need to do anything with this wisdom. Just let yourself absorb the essence of what we have explored together. Tomorrow when you wake, you may notice you see solitude differently. You may find small shifts in how you respond to being alone. This is the work of these ancient teachings, changing us gently from within. If you found value in tonight's journey, feel free to like this video and subscribe to this channel. More than anything, I hope you sleep peacefully. I hope you wake with a new appreciation for your own company. I hope you carry these teachings into your days. You are enough, exactly as you are. Your solitude is not empty. It is full of life, full of presence, full of the opportunity to finally meet yourself. Rest now, dear friend. Rest deeply. May your aloneness become a doorway to wholeness. May your silence become rich with presence. May you discover that you were never truly alone at all. Good night.